Rain from Wicked Rain Studio.
This video is on making an 1830s style Princess Anna dress inspired by Summer's Stitchery on Instagram.
So I actually started this project 3 years ago, and that's when I bought this petticoat. And this petticoat is just a traditional, standard bridal petticoat. Since I started this project 3 years ago, I've changed my mind, and instead of making a traditional Princess Anna look from the first movie, I want to make it a 1830s style. And I want to still use this petticoat, but it needs to be a slightly different shape. So what I'm going to do is shove a bum roll underneath it to try to get it to skew back and out a little bit, and hopefully that works. So as you can see, it has a much more skewed back look. It still has a nice bell kind of shape to it. This is definitely not historically accurate because it is a hoop that has metal hooping in it, and that was not used until a little bit later. It was traditionally cording and horsehair with a bum roll. But this is me modifying existing stuff I already have as opposed to trying to create a perfectly historically accurate look. And I still think I'm gonna get a pretty good, close to historical shape. So here is the skirt that I made to go over it. This skirt was about halfway finished before I completely changed directions. Originally this skirt was designed with these pieces here, and then all of the green pieces were actually going to be box plates to get that shape based on the original Frozen design. But since I'm not copying that design anymore and I'm instead doing this new 1830s look, I decided to make these as solid panels instead of box plates. And so I had to mathematically figure out how many these needed, how much I needed these to be to fit around my new hoop shape and to accommodate for the slightly longer in the back and shorter in the front. So basically what I did was I sewed it all together and then marked a new level line, which means that in the front I need 4 X's, but in the back there's actually 1, 2, 3, 4 and a half. So it's a little bit longer in the back to accommodate going over that bum roll. Half of these motifs were embroidered on my old machine 3 years ago. And the other half were embroidered on my fancy new machine now. I have no footage of that because that was done before I decided to make a video. But there is a band that goes all the way around the bottom of this that's going to be velvet and have embroidery designs on it inspired by Anna's Bodice from the movie. And so let's take a look about how that embroidery goes.
I've marked on the pattern where each embroidery motif needs to be, but I also want to be able to see that from the front so that as I line it up on my machine, I can get the embroidery at the exact right place. And so I am hand thread tracing around each rectangle. My embroidery machine is a 16 needle Melco. The hoop I'm using is a magnetic hoop called a Mighty Hoop. It's kind of amazing. It holds all of the stabilizer and fabric and everything together with magnets as opposed to using tension. This is particularly nice when dealing with velvet. It reduces the scarring. Sometimes on velvet it's good to have a water-soluble overlayer, but in this case the velvet was a very, very low pile, and I determined it wasn't needed for this particular project. It's really just mesmerizing to watch the machine go. As is typical, the one time I film a design is the time that I had my thread break and skip a few stitches and didn't quite go back far enough to cover that. So this design has a bit of a hole in one little part of the green on the left. I digitized this design myself using a program called Embird. What's really nice about a 16 needle machine is that it automatically changes colors when it's time to switch to the next one, and I don't have to stop and rethread the machine every time. It's amazing. My machine is quite fast, but this footage is sped up to 4 times its speed. Otherwise, we would sit here for about 10 minutes to watch the entire design be embroidered. If you are interested in embroidering this design yourself, I do have it available in my Rainy Day Costumes Etsy store. There'll be a link in the description. Now I've sewn the entire black panel to the bottom of my skirt. I'm adding a row of top stitching, which will be hidden by the ribbon. This will just make sure that my seam allowance stays the direction I want it to be while I sew my ribbon on. And now I'm sewing the gold ribbon along that seam. This gold ribbon will also go along the bottom of the hem. Now I'm going to fit the bodice. I've decided to combine the design of the outer bodice with the structure of a corset, and so I'm fitting the coutil base first.
So I'm seeing some lines here. I think like part of the pulling that we're seeing is the lack of boning, but I think this needs to be a little snugger up through here.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, sometimes when you're pinning, you don't have to pinch it all in. Sometimes you can just put a pin to be like, go back out to where the seam line you stitched is right there. Is a great way for marking these or things like this. Yeah, I think that is going to give you that curve at the boob that you
just
need.
Just a little more support. And then the shoulders feel good.
It's loose right here.
You want to pin that for me?
Yeah,
Here,
I
I'll
think you
turn
should
around
stick that in
and
right
can-
there, and it's gonna. Other side. Because we're gonna do it all on one side, which just makes it easier.
Now Katie is carefully leveling my waistline so that the bodice is exactly lined up with my waist all the way around. In my pattern, it had it a little bit too long in the back, and so she's marking with pins to make sure that it is exactly where I want it to be. Now I need to transfer the information from my fitting to my pattern. First, I'm going to mark with a Sharpie on the inside all of my safety pins. Then, after I've removed all of my safety pins, I will seam rip apart all of the pieces. Now I will carefully line up each piece with its pattern. I use a needlepoint tracing wheel to mark the information I gathered from my fitting onto the pattern. Then I clean up the line from my tracing wheel with a pencil and cut out the pattern. Now I lay my pattern back down on both pieces, right and left, and mark my new lines. I do this with every piece from my bodice.
So I'm gonna have a mix of boning in this project. I have some spiral steel boning, and I will have some flat steel boning, especially at the very center front and center back. And then I've also sewn on some Ridgeline, which is basically like a plastic modern boning, which is pretty similar to the sort of stays that people would have used, like reed and whalebone. There are versions of plastic boning where you can get that as a fake whalebone, but I just use Ridgeline. It's pretty close and pretty cheap. And so I'm using Ridgeline in a lot of places throughout, and I'm specifically using my spiral steel boning where I need it to be particularly curvy, because one thing that Ridgeline doesn't really do is curve very well. It's usually only pretty good at being pretty straight. And then my flat steel, just to really get it really stiff at the very center front to imitate the busk effect, and then at the back to help give strength around the grommets. I am making this kind of a cross between a bodice and a corset. It is going to lace up. It is going to have the structure of a corset inside, but it isn't I'm not going to wear a separate corset with this. This is kind of a theatrical technique as opposed to a historically accurate technique. You wouldn't actually do this in historic times, because why would you permanently attach your underwear to your shirt? But one thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that the boning in my shirt doesn't poke out, like isn't visible as a rib underneath my pretty thin taffeta. And so if I just had the bone and the coutil and then the taffeta on top, when I pressed it, you would see a ridge. And so I'm putting a layer of, just a thin layer of batting in between to kind of just cushion the boning against the taffeta. And it's not actually gonna make a difference in the size, like the whole thing isn't gonna be bigger, but it is going to kind of just give a nice little padding so I won't end up with lines visible on the outside of my garment. And I've put the Ridgeline on the front of the coutil so it won't be against my skin, because it doesn't feel really great against the body. This step isn't necessary if your fabric is not very thin. Like if you've got a nice thick wool, you really don't need to do this. It's only if you've got, or velvet, as in what Katie's Elsa design, being all velvet, she won't need to do this step because you won't get iron scarring on that. It's just needed when your fabric's really thin on the outside. So now I am pinning the front, because I've already cut out the center front pieces, because the center front has some gathering and some fanciness. So I'm pinning the whole thing together, getting all of these designs lined up. In that shape. And then sleeve.
The spiral bones will go along my princess seam center front and center back. So first I'm measuring it to make sure that my bone fits within my casing, cutting the bone with tin snips, and then I will add a bone tip to each side so that it doesn't cut through my bone casing. The flat steels go very center front and center back. Once again, I measure it to make sure it fits, cut it with my tin snips. Then I will use a Dremel to round the edges of the tips. So traditionally, you're supposed to tip bones, otherwise they poke through the garment. And you're supposed to use bone tipping fluid for most stuff, and these are bones that had professional bone tipping fluid on one end, but I had to cut them to be shorter, so I have to tip this side now. So that's what it looks like when you use bone tip, which is very nice. I don't have bone tip, so I just use fingernail polish. It works okay. It's not as thick as bone tip, and sometimes you have to do 2 coats, but it's just fine. Now we're gonna look at my sleeves. So the first thing that I have here is the control sleeve, which is the basic shape that I want everything to gather down to. And I've already put gathering stitches into my outer sleeve. And what I will do is I will line up the notches in my outer sleeve to my control sleeve to make sure that the points are centered where they should be. And then I pull all my gathering stitches to make my giant sleeve fit down into the smaller shape. Here I have gathered and stitched down the top and bottom, and now I need to stuff my sleeve. I'm just using a simple fiber fill, just like the stuff that you use for basic pillows and stuffed animals. And I'm not super stuffing this, I'm just putting enough fluff in there so that it stays fluffy without being like a solid mass. Now it's my sleeve band. I've pressed a ribbon in half, and now I'm stitching that gold ribbon around the edges of a black velvet ribbon, and this is the band that the bottom of my sleeve will gather into. It's a bit difficult to fit it all under the machine, but here I am sewing the band of my sleeve to the bottom of the sleeve after it's already been attached to the entire bodice. It would have been easier to do this step before I attached everything. So there's lots of ways to make the holes for you to do grommets, and my preferred method is actually to make a little cross with a sharp chisel, and then I can poke the grommet through. I know you can get those like grommet punchers, but they just don't work as good for me, and it's easier to keep a chisel really sharp. This particular style of grommet doesn't come with a washer to go on the back. I wish that it did. That is a better grommet in my opinion. However, since this particular garment isn't a corset that's going to get a lot of wear and tear, instead it's a cosplay that'll wear a little bit, it's okay to use this style. As you can see, there's a little anvil underneath that holds the grommet in the correct position, and I hammer from above with the proper tool that came with the grommets. Now it's time to make the bows. There are 10 fan bows on my dress. And the first step is to bag out each piece. Next, I have to press the fan design into each bow. It took me roughly half an hour per bow to press all of my fans. Each bow needed to be hand stitched at every point to keep the fan as beautiful as possible.
got this pinned across the front where I want it, and so I'm going to sew it on the inside along here to hold it in place. And this is why I didn't bother to finish the bottom edge of the bodice. Could have finished it nicely, but I knew I was covering it with the belt, so I didn't have to. I'm just going to use white thread because it's all inside. It's not going to be seen. I'm doing a cross stitch so that it has a little bit of option to move, so it's not locked in place if it needs to shift a little bit.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and check out all of the other videos that I've made.